The moment the door exploded inward, shattering the peaceful hum of closing time, everyone knew death had just walked into O'Malley's bar. 5 men stormed through the splintered wood frame, faces masked by crimson bandanas, weapons glinting under the dim amber lights that had witnessed 1,000 quiet nights. The few remaining customers, an elderly couple nursing their final beers, a tired construction worker counting his tips, froze as ice water flooded their veins. At the center of the chaos stood a man whose neck tattoos told stories written in violence, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade, demanding what he called insurance money. The calendar behind the bar read, the 15th, meaning another month had passed. Another neighborhood suffocated beneath the grip of fear. Yet amid the terror, one figure remained impossibly still. The bartender, a silver-haired man in his late 50s with weathered hands and calm grey eyes, continued drying a whiskey glass with methodical precision. He didn't reach for a phone or a hidden weapon beneath the counter where most barkeeps kept their insurance. Instead, he met the gang leader's furious glare with something unsettling, not defiance, but the quiet assessment of a man measuring distances, calculating angles, reading the room like a language only he understood. The construction worker's hands trembled so violently his coins scattered across the floor, the metallic sound punctuating each heartbeat. The elderly woman clutched her husband's arm, her knuckles white as paper, while the gang members spread through the small space like poison through water. Something in the bartender's absolute stillness made the air itself feel dangerous. The gang leader approached the bar, his weapon now pointed directly at the bartender's chest, close enough that the older man could smell the cheap cologne mixed with stale cigarette smoke. Words erupted from the tattooed mouth, threats about examples, about respect, about what happens to those who think they're above paying tribute to the new order. The elderly couple was shoved toward the door, the construction worker forced to empty his wallet on a table, while gang members laughed and made comments in rapid Spanish. Through it all, the bartender simply listened, that glass still rotating in his hands, still being dried despite already being spotless. When the gang leader finally demanded an answer, the silver-haired man spoke with a voice like gravel smoothed by rivers, quiet, measured, and somehow more frightening than any scream. 1 week, the bartender said, his voice carrying the weight of mountains that had learned to bow without breaking. Give me 7 days, and you'll have every dollar. He set the glass down with deliberate care, then reached beneath the counter, not for a weapon, but for a bottle of their finest whiskey, the kind reserved for celebrations that rarely came to neighborhoods like this. His movements held the fluid economy of a man who'd performed complex tasks under impossible pressure, each gesture containing no wasted motion, no hesitation. The gang leader's eyes narrowed with suspicion, but the bartender was already pouring 5 glasses, the amber liquid catching the light like liquid gold, an offering that somehow transformed the moment from confrontation into something stranger, more unsettling. My daughter needs surgery, the older man continued, sliding the glasses across the worn bar, surface with perfect spacing, professional precision that spoke of decades serving drinks to grateful customers rather than armed extortionists. The hospital doesn't wait for men like me to catch up with bills that grow faster than hope. His words painted a picture every person in that room understood, the crushing weight of medical debt, the impossible mathematics of survival when systems designed to help instead devoured the vulnerable. One gang member reached for his glass uncertainly, looking to his leader for permission, caught between the ritual of accepting hospitality and the performance of intimidation. The bartender's composure never wavered, though his eyes held depths of sorrow that couldn't be faked, stories written in lines around his mouth that spoke of smiles worn thin by years of carrying burdens alone. The gang leader took his glass, studying the bartender's hands as they worked, hands that showed scars most men earned in factories or construction sites, yet moved with the controlled grace of something else. Entirely "You're too calm, old man," he said, suspicion dripping from each word like venom seeking ground to poison. "People shake when we visit. They cry, they beg, they sometimes try to be heroes." He drank, and the whiskey's quality registered in his expression, expensive warmth sliding down his throat while his mind worked to reconcile the contradictions before him. The other gang members spread through the bar, examining photographs on walls that documented community, little league teams, retirement parties, weddings celebrated in this sanctuary where ordinary people built ordinary lives despite extraordinary hardships. But one photograph drew attention like gravity. Behind the bar, partially obscured by bottles, hung a faded image of a younger version of the silver-haired bartender, leaner and harder, surrounded by men whose eyes carried the same dangerous stillness. The uniforms were unmistakable, the weapons sophisticated, the background deliberately vague. In that way, military photographs often were when documenting people who operated in shadows. The gang leader noticed the military tattoos then, markings on the bartender's forearms that told stories about units that didn't officially exist, about conflicts never publicly acknowledged. Tension crystallized in the air like ice forming on windows, and suddenly the older man's composure transformed from weakness into something far more threatening, the patience of someone who'd survived situations that would have destroyed lesser men. The gang leader's glass stopped halfway to his lips as his eyes locked onto the photograph, recognition dawning like storm clouds gathering on a previously clear horizon. He set the whiskey down with trembling fingers, his swagger evaporating as he studied the image more carefully. The tactical gear, the weapons that spoke of precision operations, the backdrop that could have been any desert where America fought wars the evening news barely covered. "What unit?" he asked, his voice stripped of its earlier bravado, replaced by the cautious respect soldiers learned when encountering warriors whose reputations preceded them like thunder before lightning. The bartender continued drying glasses with methodical attention, each circular motion of his cloth deliberate and hypnotic, refusing to acknowledge the question as though his past existed in a separate dimension from this humble establishment where neighborhood. Families celebrated birthdays and drowned sorrows in equal measure. Another gang member leaned closer to the photograph, his tattoo-covered neck craning forward as he traced the insignia partially visible on the younger bartender's shoulder, a symbol associated with missions that never appeared in official records, with operators who became ghosts. Long before their bodies stopped breathing, the worn frame held other details too, commendations barely visible in the background, the 1,000-yard stares of men who'd witnessed humanity at its most broken, the casual positioning of weapons held by people for whom violence had become a second language, spoken more fluently than words of peace. The bartender's hands, those scarred instruments of hospitality, suddenly seemed capable of entirely different work, the kind that ended conflicts permanently rather than serving drinks that temporarily softened life's sharp edges. Around the room, the gang members' postures shifted imperceptibly, predators recognizing another apex hunter who'd simply chosen to disguise himself in gentleman's clothing. "Those tattoos," the gang leader said, pointing with his chin toward the bartender's forearms, where ink told stories in symbolic language, understood by those who'd served in darkness. "I knew a man once who had similar markings, said they were given to operators who completed missions nobody could survive, missions that required men to become something other than human for their country's protection." The bartender finally looked up, meeting the gang leader's eyes with a gaze that held neither fear nor aggression, only the profound weariness of someone who'd traveled too far down violent roads and found no destination worth the journey. Outside, the neighborhood slept in fragile peace, unaware that inside this ordinary bar, two worlds were colliding, the chaotic brutality of street gangs meeting the disciplined lethality of sanctioned warfare. The youngest gang member, Miguel, felt his stomach tighten as he watched the silent communication passing between his leader and The old bartender, understanding instinctively that they'd entered a situation far more complex than simple extortion. The silver-haired man finally spoke, his words measured like a surgeon's incisions. "I poured those drinks as a courtesy, a gesture of respect between men who understand that violence solves nothing while creating endless complications." His voice carried authority that transcended the humble setting, the accent of someone who'd given orders in situations where hesitation meant death, where split-second decisions determined whether operations succeeded or entire teams vanished into classified failure. The gang leader nodded slowly, recognizing the unspoken message. This bartender could pay their protection money, or he could become a problem that would cost them far more than any weekly tribute could ever compensate. The morning sun filtered through the bar's dusty windows like fractured hope when Miguel returned alone, his footsteps hesitant against the wooden floor, as though each step carried the weight of betrayal against his own blood. He found the bartender arranging bottles with the same methodical precision from the previous night, those weathered hands moving with purpose that transcended simple preparation for another day's business. The young man's eyes darted toward the street repeatedly, checking for shadows that might report his presence here, his loyalty divided between survival and something deeper, a moral compass not yet corrupted by the violence he'd witnessed but never truly embraced. "They're going to kill you regardless," Miguel whispered, his voice cracking with the particular anguish of someone forced to choose between complicity and courage, between protecting his own family and warning a stranger who'd shown him unexpected dignity. The bartender nodded without surprise, continuing his work as though death threats were simply another item on his daily inventory, another reality to be acknowledged and prepared for, with the same calm acceptance he brought to every task. Miguel's hands trembled as he explained how the gang had murdered a shopkeeper the previous month, even after receiving payment, how his own initiation had involved violence that still haunted his sleep with images he couldn't erase, no matter how tightly he closed his eyes. "My mother, my little sister, they said they'd burn our house with them inside if I didn't prove my loyalty, if I didn't become one of them," he continued, tears threatening to break through the tough facade he'd constructed to survive in a world that offered young men like him only brutality or victimhood. The bartender finally stopped his work, turning to face this reluctant soldier with eyes that held recognition deeper than judgment, understanding born from his own history of impossible choices made in darkness. He poured 2 glasses of water, sliding one across the polished wood toward Miguel with a gesture that transformed a simple bar into confessional space, offering absolution through acknowledgement rather than words. "They're coming back in 3 days with more men, planning to make an example of you in front of the whole neighborhood," Miguel said, accepting the water with gratitude that extended beyond simple thirst to encompass this moment of human connection in a life starved of genuine compassion. The bartender's expression remained unchanged, but something flickered behind his eyes, calculation mixing with determination, the strategic mind of a warrior assessing variables and forming plans that existed several moves ahead of his opponent's understanding. Outside, the neighborhood awakened to another day of ordinary struggles, parents walking children to school along streets where violence lurked beneath surfaces of normalcy, where good people adapted to circumstances that should never require adaptation. Miguel watched the silver-haired man, seeing not weakness, but something far more dangerous. The quiet strength of someone who'd already lost everything, who therefore had nothing left to fear, whose redemption required action rather than continued hiding. "Your family will be safe," the bartender said finally, his words carrying the certainty of promises made by men who understood that some oaths transcended personal survival, that protection of innocence justified risks no rational person would accept. Miguel felt something shift inside his chest, hope piercing through the resignation he'd carried like armor against disappointment, the possibility that perhaps not all adults were either predators or powerless victims, but some existed as guardians who chose to stand between darkness and light. The bartender returned to his preparations with renewed purpose. Each movement now clearly part of larger choreography Miguel couldn't fully comprehend, but instinctively trusted, the dance of someone who'd spent decades transforming chaos into controlled outcomes. In that moment, the young man understood he'd just witnessed something profound, an ordinary person revealing extraordinary courage, a humble bartender demonstrating that dignity and strength weren't contradictions but complements, that sometimes the most powerful resistance came not from matching violence with greater violence, but from refusing to surrender one's humanity, regardless of the cost. The bartender walked to the back office with Miguel following, his movements deliberate as a man approaching a confessional he'd avoided for 2 decades, the weight of suppressed history finally demanding acknowledgement. He unlocked a drawer beneath the register and withdrew a faded manila folder, its edges worn soft from years of storage, containing newspaper clippings yellowed with time and photographs that captured moments when he'd been someone entirely different. "My name wasn't always Thomas," he began, spreading the documents across the scarred wooden desk like evidence in a trial where he served as both prosecutor and defendant, revealing fragments of identity he deliberately buried beneath layers of ordinary routine. Miguel leaned closer, eyes widening as he processed images of military operations in distant lands, commendations written in formal language that praised valor, while concealing the human cost of classified missions executed in shadows where accountability dissolved into national security. The young man saw transformation documented in reverse, a hardened operative gradually softening into the silver-haired bartender who'd poured drinks with unexpected kindness, evolution born from deliberate choice rather than circumstance. "I was part of teams that didn't officially exist, conducting operations our government would never acknowledge if things went wrong," Thomas continued, his voice carrying the particular exhaustion of men who'd served causes larger than themselves, only to discover that righteousness grew complicated when examined through blood and consequence. He pointed to one photograph showing 6 soldiers standing before a helicopter in some unidentified desert, their faces young and confident with the invincibility that comes before experience teaches humility through loss. Miguel recognized that expression. He'd seen it in mirrors before his own initiation shattered innocence. Before he understood that violence corrupted everyone, it touched regardless of which side claimed justice. Thomas traced his finger across faces in the photograph, naming men who'd become ghosts, brothers who died in operations erased from official records, their sacrifices known only to families who couldn't speak the truth about how their sons and husbands had vanished into classified darkness. 20 years ago, a mission collapsed in ways I still can't discuss without breaking oaths that transcend my personal redemption, Thomas said, his hands trembling slightly as memory invaded present moment with force that time couldn't diminish. Intelligence had been wrong, civilians had died, and he'd been forced to choose between following orders and preserving his humanity, a choice that ended his career but saved his soul, leaving him searching for purpose in a world that suddenly felt impossibly fragile. Thomas tapped the keyboard in his cramped back office during quiet afternoon hours when sunlight filtered through dusty windows, transforming his workspace into something resembling a confessional where sins were documented rather than absolved. The security monitors displayed typical bar scenes, customers laughing over beers, transactions at the register, conversations that meant nothing. But hidden within ordinary footage lay something far more valuable that he'd been cultivating with patience learned from years of intelligence work: Every gang member who'd entered his establishment had been catalogued with methodical precision, their faces captured from multiple angles, their conversations recorded through microphones disguised as ambient speakers, their hierarchical relationships mapped through observation. That appeared casual, but missed absolutely nothing. He'd built detailed profiles the way priests might maintain records of parishioners, except his documentation served justice rather than salvation, each file representing families who might be saved from violence that had already stolen too much from communities learning to survive amid chaos. The encrypted files transferred silently through networks that couldn't be traced, reaching contacts who existed in governmental shadows, where official operations ended and necessary actions began. Thomas had learned coding during sleepless nights, when memories became too heavy, teaching himself digital skills that transformed his bar into an intelligence hub more effective than any official surveillance operation, hampered by warrants and constitutional limitations. He documented supply routes observed through casual conversations, identified safe houses mentioned carelessly by members who'd grown comfortable in his presence, tracked territorial disputes that erupted into violence he'd witnessed aftermath of through customers seeking refuge. Miguel's arrival had been documented too, but Thomas had recognized something different in the young man's eyes. Fear rather than cruelty, desperation instead of pride. Qualities that suggested possibility for redemption that others had surrendered completely. The bartender reviewed footage, showing himself moving through routines that appeared mundane, but served dual purposes he'd perfected through repetition. Pouring drinks allowed observation of body language, revealing intoxication levels that loosened tongues and exposed secrets. Cleaning tables positioned him near conversations meant to be private, restocking shelves provided. Cover for adjusting camera angles that captured new associates joining the organization. He'd become invisible through consistency, just another working man struggling through ordinary existence while secretly dismantling the very network that considered him prey rather than predator, his silver hair and quiet demeanor concealing determination. Forged through loss that demanded meaning, Thomas saved the latest files with satisfaction that came from purpose reclaimed, knowing that every documented interaction brought justice closer for families like Miguel's who deserved protection that institutions couldn't provide. His daughter's photograph watched from the wall, her smile frozen in time before violence had stolen futures she'd never experience, and he whispered promises to her memory that this mission would honor her loss by preventing others from experiencing similar devastation. The gang arrived 3 nights ahead of schedule, their vehicles surrounding the establishment like predators circling wounded prey, headlights cutting through evening darkness with aggressive intensity that announced violence before words could threaten. Doors crashed open with force designed to intimidate, boots thundering across wooden floors that had witnessed countless peaceful conversations, now violated by malicious intent, their weapons gleaming under amber lighting that transformed familiar space into battlefield territory. The leader strode forward with confidence borrowed from numbers and firepower, his expression carved from cruelty, refined through years of inflicting suffering upon communities too frightened to resist his organization's parasitic expansion. Behind him followed reinforcements, 15 men, carrying hardware designed for warfare rather than intimidation. Their presence declaring this visit would conclude with bloodshed that would echo through neighborhoods as warning against defiance. Yet the bar stood empty, except for shadows dancing across walls decorated with photographs chronicling ordinary lives, and one cellular device resting upon polished wood like artifact, waiting to deliver revelation that would shatter their assumptions completely. The leader approached the phone with suspicion, warranted by experience teaching him that empty rooms often conceal dangers more lethal than confrontation, his hand hovering near his weapon while gestures commanded his soldiers to search every corner for ambush they expected from desperate Bartender, making final stand. The device activated automatically at his proximity, screen illuminating with video showing Thomas seated calmly in his back office, silver hair catching light that made him appear almost ethereal, his expression carrying neither fear nor aggression, but rather certainty belonging to men who'd accepted destiny and prepared accordingly. His voice emerged through speakers, with quality suggesting professional recording equipment rather than smartphone technology, each word delivered with precision that commanded attention despite absence of volume or theatrical emphasis. "My name isn't Thomas Martinez," he began, pausing to let confusion register across faces accustomed to controlling narratives through violence. "I'm callsign Phantom, and you've been hunting a ghost who's been studying predators pretending to be apex when they're merely parasites feeding on vulnerable populations." The gang members exchanged glances, revealing discomfort-penetrating bravado they'd worn like armor against consequences, their weapons suddenly feeling inadequate against enemy who'd transformed simple bar into intelligence operation that had dissected their organization with surgical thoroughness. The leader's hand trembled slightly as recognition dawned. Phantom was legend whispered among criminal networks, a operative whose missions had dismantled cartels and terrorist cells with efficiency that seemed supernatural. Someone believed eliminated decades ago in operation that had supposedly killed everyone involved. Thomas continued speaking with calm that unsettled more than shouting ever could, explaining how months of documentation had mapped their entire network, identified every associate, tracked every transaction, compiled evidence that would survive even if they destroyed him tonight, because copies already resided in hands that would ensure justice manifested regardless of his survival. Outside, tactical teams materialized from darkness like specters, answering summons from beyond, their movements coordinated through training that transformed individual soldiers into single organism operating with unified purpose. These weren't police constrained by regulations designed to protect rights that criminals exploited. These were Phantom's brothers, operatives who'd thought their commander dead until encrypted files had arrived containing intelligence too valuable to ignore and personal enough to carry authentication no imposter could replicate. The trap had closed with inevitability, transforming hunters into prey, and the bartender's quiet dignity had orchestrated symphony of justice that would resonate through communities finally receiving protection they deserved from humble man who'd transformed grief into purpose, transcending personal loss. The tactical perimeter contracted with mathematical precision, operators moving through shadows with fluidity that suggested choreography perfected through decades of operating beyond civilization's comfortable boundaries. Their night vision, equipment transforming darkness into green-tinged clarity, where gang members appeared as thermal signatures trapped inside architecture that had become their cage. These weren't government agents constrained by procedural limitations. They were Phantom's original unit, soldiers who'd mourned a commander they believed lost to bureaucratic betrayal. Men who'd received his encrypted transmissions like messages from beyond death itself, each data packet containing intelligence wrapped in personal codes that authenticated his survival beyond doubt. They'd abandoned retirement, interrupted civilian careers, traveled from distant continents, answering summons that transcended duty, responding to brother who'd never abandoned the mission even when his country had abandoned him. Their loyalty forged in conflicts where trust meant survival and betrayal meant graves in unmarked territories. Captain Morrison led the insertion, his weathered face bearing scars from operations that remained classified in vaults protected by security clearances few possessed, his eyes reflecting grief transformed into purpose when Phantom's first message had arrived 18 months ago, containing simple words that shattered years of acceptance. Still fighting, still breathing, need extraction for innocence caught in crossfire. The unit had mobilized immediately, embedding themselves within the community as mechanics, teachers, shop owners, ordinary people hiding extraordinary capabilities, while their commander gathered evidence that would justify intervention outside legal frameworks designed for peacetime rather than warfare waged in neighborhood streets. Tonight represented culmination of patient intelligence work, and Morrison felt pride watching his team execute maneuvers that honored Phantom's meticulous planning, every position calculated to minimize collateral damage while maximizing psychological impact upon criminals who'd mistaken anonymity for invincibility. Inside the bar, the gang leader's radio crackled, with panicked transmissions from lookouts reporting professional operators surrounding their position, voices rising with fear, recognizing they faced enemies operating beyond their experience or capability to counter effectively. His second-in-command stepped forward then, removing the bandana that had marked his allegiance, revealing expression, mixing sorrow with grim satisfaction as he disclosed his true identity. Carlos Mendoza, whose sister Maria had died in crossfire 5 years ago, whose grief had driven him to infiltrate the organization that had stolen futures from countless families, whose partnership with Phantom had provided the internal access necessary to map corruption's complete anatomy. The revelation struck harder than bullets could have. Trust dissolving like foundation built on sand, suddenly exposed to truth's unforgiving tide, and the leader understood completely that his empire had been hollow long before tonight's reckoning arrived with inevitable force. Miguel watched from protected distance as federal vehicles arrived transporting his mother and younger siblings toward Sanctuary Phantom had arranged weeks before, his heart swelling with gratitude toward silver-haired guardian who'd recognized goodness trapped within circumstances beyond the young man's control, who'd offered redemption instead of judgment, who'd proven that dignity persisted even in professions demanding moral compromise for greater purpose. Carlos Mendoza stood in the bar's amber light, his hands steady as he faced the man who'd corrupted everything his sister had died fighting against, tears tracking silently down cheeks that bore scars from years of maintaining cover deep within darkness that consumed souls less anchored by purpose. His voice emerged quiet, but unyielding, carrying weight of accumulated grief, transformed into instrument of justice that had required sacrificing his own safety to protect neighborhoods drowning beneath criminal enterprise disguised as brotherhood. Maria believed people deserved better than fear, he said, pulling from his jacket the wire recorder that had captured months of confessions, transactions, hierarchies mapped through conversations held in false confidence. The gang leader's face collapsed into recognition of complete defeat, understanding that empire built on intimidation had crumbled from within, undermined by loyalty he'd never truly earned but had assumed through violence and manipulation. Around them, Phantom's team secured exits with professional efficiency that spoke of shared history, forged in conflicts where precision meant survival, their movements flowing like water, finding inevitable paths through landscape of consequence. The silver-haired bartender emerged from shadows behind the counter, his posture carrying military bearing, no longer concealed beneath civilian performance he'd maintained through countless shifts pouring drinks while documenting evil, his eyes meeting Carlos with respect between warriors who'd fought separate battles toward identical victory. "Your sister would be proud," Phantom said simply, words landing with gravity that made Carlos's chest tighten. With emotions too complex for easy categorization, grief mixed with vindication, exhaustion tangled with relief, sorrow transformed finally into meaning through sacrifice that honored memory rather than drowning within it. The photograph behind the bar caught fading light, showing daughter whose death had initiated this patient crusade against the violence, claiming innocent futures. her smile frozen in moment before tragedy had redirected her father's path toward redemption, measured in families saved from similar devastation. Miguel watched through the bar's window as federal agents processed gang members with bureaucratic efficiency that seemed almost anticlimactic following surgical operation that had dismantled criminal network through intelligence rather than bloodshed. His mother's arms wrapped around younger siblings whose faces showed confusion, gradually transforming into hope's tentative emergence. He understood completely that tonight represented more than arrests or justice served through conventional channels. It demonstrated that goodness persisted even when surrounded by corruption's suffocating pressure, that individuals possessed power to resist circumstances attempting to define their character through geography or circumstance beyond their choosing. Phantom had seen potential within frightened young man forced into impossible choices, had offered pathway toward dignity, when easier response would have been judgment or dismissal, had proven through patient action that redemption remained possible for those willing to choose courage over comfort. The bartender locked eyes with Miguel across distance, separating protection from confrontation, nodding once with expression conveying pride and recognition that transcended words, silently communicating truth the young man would carry forward through whatever future now opened before him. That honor wasn't inherited through bloodlines or granted through institutional validation, but forged through daily choices to resist darkness, even when resistance seemed futile, to protect others, even when self-preservation whispered easier alternatives, to believe that single person maintaining integrity could shift trajectories for entire communities trapped beneath violence's weight. Miguel straightened his shoulders, feeling transformation solidifying within his chest like steel, cooling into unbreakable form, understanding that tonight's events had given him something more valuable than mere physical safety. They'd restored his faith in possibility itself, in the enduring power of individuals who refused to accept evil as inevitable, who fought with intelligence and patience rather than surrendering to rage or despair. Days following the operation, Phantom unlocked the small apartment above the bar, where morning light filtered through curtains that had witnessed 15 years of solitary routine, built around purpose rather than healing. Pulling from beneath his bed a wooden box containing photographs and letters from a daughter whose laughter still echoed through memories too precious to release, yet too painful to constantly examine, he traced fingers across images showing birthday parties and graduation ceremonies, ordinary moments transformed into unbearable treasures by violence that had stolen future chapters from story that deserved decades more development. His throat tightening with grief that time had softened but never erased. Miguel sat beside him, at the small kitchen table, understanding without explanation that this ritual represented trust and vulnerability from man who'd spent years armoring himself behind mission's clarity, who'd channeled devastation into protection because sitting still meant drowning beneath weight of questions without answers. Her name was Sophia, Phantom said. Quietly, voice carrying texture of sorrow, transformed through years into something resembling acceptance, though never peace. She believed people were fundamentally good, that neighborhoods could heal themselves if given chance to breathe without fear's constant pressure. The words hung between them, like prayer offered to witness who might carry. Forward flame that flickering threatened to extinguish. Miguel recognized sacred ground being shared, responsibility being passed from guardian too weary to continue alone towards successor who'd proven worthy through courage, demonstrated when easier paths beckoned. Outside, the neighborhood stirred with rhythms of families beginning daily routines. No longer shadowed by criminal enterprise that had extracted tribute from every transaction, every dream deferred by protection, money demanded as price for simply existing within territory, claimed through intimidation rather than legitimate authority or community consent. Children walked to school without calculating dangerous corners requiring avoidance, their parents' faces showing relaxation that came from fear's absence rather than merely its temporary suppression. Phantom watched through window as Miguel's younger brother played soccer in street previously dominated by lookouts and enforcers. The boy's laughter, rising clear and unguarded in air, finally scrubbed clean of tension that had poisoned ordinary moments. "This is what Sophia wanted," he continued, gesturing towards scene of reclaimed normalcy that represented victory more meaningful than any tactical success or enemy defeated. Not grand gestures or headlines, just people living without calculation, without measuring every word and action against potential consequences. Delivered by those claiming ownership over geography and souls residing within it. Miguel nodded slowly, absorbing lesson about power's true measure, about legacy built through accumulated small dignities restored rather than spectacular confrontations that burned bright but left nothing sustainable behind. The bartender placed photograph of Sophia beside image, showing Miguel's family leaving courthouse, where testimony had sealed convictions that would reshape criminal landscape throughout entire region. Two pictures representing beginning and continuation of story that had required 15 years of patient determination to write toward chapter resembling redemption. "I couldn't save her," Phantom admitted, words emerging with difficulty that revealed wound never fully closed, despite years of productive channeling through protective action. "But watching you choose testimony over silence, seeing your mother's face when she understood her children were finally safe, that's as close to peace as I've found since the world took my daughter and left me searching for meaning in rubble of shattered future." His eyes met Miguel's with intensity that conveyed both gratitude and expectation, silently communicating that mantle was being shared rather than abandoned, that responsibility for maintaining neighborhood's hard-won safety now rested on shoulders of young man who'd demonstrated capacity for courage that many adults never discovered within themselves. Miguel felt weight settling across his chest, not burdensome but grounding, anchoring him to purpose that transcended personal survival or individual ambition, connecting him to community that had suffered too long beneath violence, presented as inevitable when it had always been choice made by those prioritizing profit over human dignity. As afternoon light shifted toward evening, Phantom walked Miguel to door where their paths would diverge toward separate but aligned futures. The older man's hand resting briefly on younger man's shoulder with pressure that communicated volumes beyond verbal capacity to capture. Pride, hope, faith that goodness perpetuated itself through examples witnessed and internalized by those ready to carry forward torch that never extinguished completely despite darkness's best efforts. "You're not my blood," Phantom said finally, voice rough with emotions carefully controlled, but no longer entirely concealed behind operational detachment that had sustained him through years of dangerous proximity to evil requiring documentation. "But you're the son I needed to believe still existed, proof that Sophia's faith in human goodness wasn't naive optimism, but accurate assessment temporarily obscured by criminals claiming authority they'd never legitimately possessed." Miguel embraced the man who'd saved not just his family, but his fundamental belief in possibility, in capacity for individual action to matter against forces that appeared overwhelming when faced without strategy, patience, and absolute commitment to principles worth sacrificing comfort to defend. They separated silently, both understanding that ending represented beginning, that story continued forward through choices made daily by ordinary people refusing to accept evil as permanent condition rather than temporary circumstance, requiring persistent resistance. What would you do if faced with impossible choices between family and conscience? Subscribe to explore more. Stories of courage emerging from darkness.